Hello, everyone, and welcome to It Matters Radio Spoken Word Broadcast. And of course, as always, Mr. Kenneth Weene is with us, and he is going to be handling the spoken word interviews as he does each and every Sunday evening for you at 7 p.m. Eastern Time. And I heard, Ken, that you had a kind of a different guest today on.
I do have somebody a little different for us today. She is a member of Time Magazine's staff, a journalist, a writer.
Ah.
And wrote a piece that I just fell in love with.
Oh, good. Well,
And
I can't wait to hear about that.
it was her personal experience, and I'm not going to say more than that because I know she's going to share about it, but a personal experience serving on a jury.
Ah.
And her name is J. Newton Small. And Monica, by the way, I'm going to tell you right up front during the show, I'm going to invite her to come back.
Okay.
Because she has written a book that I want to read. I haven't read it yet, and as you know, I never discuss a book on the show if I haven't read it.
Yes.
But it's a great book. It's called Broad Influence: How Women Are Changing the Way America Works. And anybody who can pun in their title that well, I immediately love.
I immediately love the title. Of course, I'm a woman.
She also has a very interesting internet website. It's a kind of a startup of an idea.
And you're going to tell us about that?
And we're also going to be talking about that. Okay. So, folks, I think you're going to really love listening to J. Newton Small. Now, unfortunately, today, Jay is not going to be joining us on video, only on audio.
Okay.
But she has promised me that when she comes back, we'll get to see her on live camera.
Okay. All right.
Okay.
That sounds great. Okay, folks, here we go.
Folks, I'm really delighted to have J. Newton Small with us today. Jay, thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule. I know, among other things, you report for Time Magazine.
I do. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah. What brought you to my attention was I read this absolutely fabulous piece you did about serving on a jury. Now, where was that jury?
It was here in Washington, D.C.
Okay, in the Capitol. Okay, mm-hmm. And it was a criminal trial, I believe, wasn't it?
Yes, it was a stabbing.
A stabbing, oh boy. And there were issues that came to your attention as the jury deliberated that made me anyway, really think about what's going on and can we grow as a country to have a good jury system, a good legal system. Why don't you tell our audience a little bit about what you realized?
So the jury was, the case was a stabbing, an alleged stabbing, where a young man, we were actually never told his name, never told his age. His name was Carlos Galloway, had allegedly assaulted and stabbed an older man named Vernon Hungerford. And these two men were standing outside the apartment building where they both lived in Anacostia, which is a predominantly African-American community or part of Washington, D.C., on the morning of April 1st, April Fool's Day, earlier this year, around 9 a.m. in the morning. And they were both African-American, and the young Carlos Galloway had basically given Vernon Hungerford a Bluetooth speaker. And Vernon Hungerford had said that he was going to pay Carlos Galloway for it. But in the last 3 weeks, he hadn't actually paid. And so when Carlos found Vernon outside the apartment building that morning, he said he wanted his money, and they got into an altercation. Nobody really witnessed this first altercation. All of this testimony just came actually mostly from the victim, who was Vernon Hungerford. But apparently, according to witnesses, the Carlos Galloway went back into the building, said, went and got allegedly a knife from his apartment, came back downstairs, and the witnesses said they heard him coming down the stairs yelling something about money. He came outside, and in front of the office, the management office for that apartment building, where the superintendent for the building was there, and there was also a day worker there. The superintendent of the building was called Roxo, and the day worker was called Gnu. Both of these people, who had nothing to do with either the witness or the defendant, or the victim or defendant, witnessed this altercation. And so in front of their office, Carlos Galloway again met Vernon Hungerford, and they started yelling about money. Carlos Galloway took out a knife, and in an overhead stabbing motion, although nobody saw the knife, the witnesses actually just said he took out something from his pocket. They didn't see what it was. And an overhead stabbing motion seemed stabbed towards Vernon Hungerford. Now, Vernon Hungerford threw up his hands to protect himself, and one of his hands was punctured, and there was blood everywhere, and they saw this happen. And then Carlos Galloway left the scene, went behind the building, and Vernon Hungerford went inside the building to call an ambulance. And there was blood all over the sidewalk, blood inside the building. And indeed, the witnesses also called 911 and said they'd witnessed this violent altercation. And what was interesting was, the prosecutor laid out the case for the jury. And we had the two witnesses, Roxo and Gnu, and you had 3 police officers who investigated the crime, who also testified that they found the blood. They found a bloody knife nearby, which they presumed but never actually physically linked it to the case. They presumed it was linked to the case, but they never actually made that physical link. And they had the victim himself, Vernon Hungerford, who testified to being stabbed in the hand. So we had this 2 days of testimony, and then we sequestered ourselves and deliberated. And I have to admit that I was one of the jurors. And so to give you an idea, the jury was actually 5 black women, 6 black women, 5 white people, so 2 men and 3 white women, and then me, and I'm a Eurasian mix. So I sort of was neither one nor the other. And so when we started deliberations, most of the white people, and I was one of these people too, we actually believed the testimony of the witnesses. They didn't seem to have any motivation to lie, and of the police officers. The black women did not believe the testimony at all of the police officers or of even the witnesses. They felt the witnesses were kind of railroading this young man, and the young man was diminutive. He looked very young. He looked kind of scared to be at trial, and so I think there was a lot of sympathy for him and a lot of sort of bafflement by the jury of why we were at this trial for such a minor thing, right? Like, I mean, the Vernon Hungerford's injuries were so slight that he didn't even go to hospital that day. He went to work and just sort of got bandaged up by the ambulance and went to work. And so there was this real sense of like, why are we here, kind of, for this jury. But it became this kind of very acrimonious debate. The one person none of us believed was Vernon Hungerford, and almost from the get-go, we all threw out his testimony because he just didn't seem trustworthy. He seemed to be baiting and bullying the young man, even from the stand, from the witness stand. He was very unpleasant. He admitted to having drugs. There was a lot of implications that he might have been on drugs at the time. And nobody thought that he was a credible witness in this case. And so right off the bat, we threw out the sort of testimony of Vernon Hungerford, who was the victim. But a lot of, most of the white jurors, including myself in the beginning, felt that there was no real reason to question the testimony of the 2 witnesses and the 3 police officers. The black women, for the most part, not all of them are monolithic either, but the black women, for the most part, absolutely did question those witnesses and felt, increasingly attacked by the white jurors, because the white jurors were like, how can you question this? Of course, it's so obvious. There's this evidence. Why would you ever question the police? And the black women started to say, you know what, like, we live in a society, and where we're from, and 3 of them were actually from this neighborhood in Anacostia where the crime took place. Where we're from, we do question the police. We don't believe that the police are there to help us. You may believe that the police in your neighborhoods are there to help you, but in our neighborhoods, they're not. They're there, to almost to punish us. And it was, and they're our adversaries. And they didn't believe the prosecutor. They didn't believe the witnesses. They felt that the witnesses, the building supervisor was railroading the young man because he might have been a troublemaker in the building and he just wanted to get rid of a troublemaker. But they really felt that they weren't going to and indict this young man for and ruin his life, and not indict, I guess he was already indicted, but they weren't going to find him guilty and kind of ruin his life. And so we really had a problem because there was, these two sides of the jury just didn't like each other, didn't talk to each other, were very acrimonious, were increasingly kind of combatant with each other.
If I may interrupt you for a moment before we get into what then went on within the jury, I had two questions that I think we need to know just so people can follow this a little more clearly. First, did the defendant, this young man, did he take the stand?
No, so the defendant never actually testified, which we thought was strange as well, because we wanted to hear from him, but we never heard from him.
Okay, and of course the other question is, what was the charge? Because as you pointed out, obviously, at least to the black members of the jury, it seemed rather a minimal thing. The man didn't even have to go to the hospital. I don't know if he wanted to press charges or not. And I was wondering what was the charge and the potential penalty that was.
So there were two charges. The first charge was assault with a dangerous weapon. And then the second charge, if we found guilty for that charge, which then the second charge was carrying a dangerous weapon. We were instructed by the judge not to consider penalties, so we weren't told what the penalties were. If we found the defendant not guilty of the first charge, then there was an option of considering a lesser second charge of simple assault instead. So there were really sort of three moving pieces. If you found guilty of the first one, then you would consider the second charge of assault with a dangerous weapon. Then you could consider the second charge of carrying a dangerous weapon. If you did not find him guilty of assault with a dangerous weapon, then you could also consider whether or not he was guilty of simple assault.
Okay. Thank you for clarifying that. So now, now we're in the jury room, and you have this group of black women, most of whom felt they couldn't trust the system, and some white folks who most of whom felt you could trust the system, and you kind of being the swing vote. That's very interesting. You're really in a very ticklish position. How uncomfortable were you as the one person who didn't belong, as it were, to either camp, as they seem to?
It was strange. So this is, this is going to sound sort of strangely egotistical, but it's not. I don't know if you've ever read Gandhi's early writings.
Some.
So he spent a lot of time in South Africa, in apartheid South Africa, and he wrote a lot about being the kind of odd man out, the third person or a third race in a society that was black and white, and having no dog whatsoever in that fight, but how strange it was to watch these two races just completely talk past each other, completely not try to understand each other. And I'm not likening myself on any level to Gandhi. He was amazing and obviously, awesome and whatever else. But I did for the first time in my life kind of begin to understand some of those writings and what it felt like to be, in a situation where I didn't really have a dog in this fight. Like I'm not white, I'm not black. I am a person of color, but a woman of color. But I don't know what it's like to be an African American woman. I don't feel persecuted by the police, But I am also a journalist who has spent a lot of time writing about race and trying to understand race. And so I spent 2 months last year in Charleston, South Carolina, writing Times cover story on the Emanuel 9 massacre. So it's the killing of 9 African American parishioners in a church, in the Emmanuel Church in the basement of in Charleston, by a white supremacist, or the alleged killing, I should say.
I have to interrupt you to say I read that piece by you, and I will tell you that it took me a while to read it because I kept crying.
Oh, thank you. I wrote it with obviously David Vondrelli and Maya Rodin. There were 3 of us who were there, and it was a really hard assignment because we interviewed 200 people, family members of the victims, and of the survivors, and we interviewed the survivors as well, and it was very wrenching, having these conversations with people who'd really lost, and it was a huge tragedy for them, lost loved ones, and I don't think there was one interview that we had where people didn't cry. And so, having spent the 2 months in Charleston and having also written, earlier this summer I was in Dallas, where I covered the killing of 5 police officers at a Black Lives Rally matter, and I've had some experience writing about these issues. I felt that it was important to try to understand where the Black ladies were coming from, and during the first day's deliberations, I sort of said essentially this: like I've covered both sides of the story, and I think it's important that that we all consider each other's perspectives as much as possible, and try to understand and appreciate and respect each other's opinions as much as possible. And I think that helped to some degree win me some, not support, but the Black ladies felt like I listened to them to some degree, and so they were but it was really striking how tone deaf I think a lot of the white jurors were. Like they just didn't see that. They did not feel like that they were being racist at all. They felt like the Black jurors were being unreasonable, that that it was nonsensical, that they wouldn't believe the information or the evidence, and there was a lot of impatience because they wanted to leave. They wanted to get on with their lives, and so there was increasingly things got acrimonious. By the end of the first day, one of the Black jurors felt so attacked personally and just so wronged that she ultimately asked to be taken off the jury, and we had to start on the next day of deliberations with a new juror who was another Black woman, who was sort of more in line with the other Black ladies in the jury as well. But there was one particular Black juror who her son had been a witness in a case where of a stabbing, a very similar case, and he'd been an eyewitness who'd identified a man he was convinced was the perpetrator. It turned out that he was wrong, and that the man that he had thought had done the crime actually hadn't done the crime. And that man ended up going to prison, and then later was exonerated when DNA evidence or other things cleared him. And they realized that another man who looked very similar to that first man, was actually guilty. And so this one woman just was never going to. She felt that she could not believe the eyewitnesses at all. She really just thought they were not credible, and that it was so dubious being an eyewitness in a case. And all of the Black women really started to question why the police didn't test the knife. Why didn't they test the blood in the knife? Why didn't they test the knife for fingerprints? I mean, how could you connect that knife to the case without actually having forensic evidence, considering nobody saw the knife being used in the stabbing? Actually, the witnesses saw something, but they didn't see a knife. And nobody saw the knife being dropped by Carlos Galloway. So increasingly, the women were like, how can you believe that there was a knife there, even, and that this was the knife was even used, and even though there was clearly a puncture wound, and there were pictures of the puncture wound, and there was blood everywhere, pictures of the blood everywhere, they just started, well, what if Vernon Hungerford had stabbed himself, because he admitted that he had a box cutter in his pocket, and he was, might have used it to defend himself, but ultimately didn't. And they were very suspicious of Vernon Hungerford as trying to frame this young man, because Vernon Hungerford was this older kind of, and they didn't trust him at all. They felt that he was this bad man who was trying to somehow frame this younger man for a crime that he would probably committed, which would be stabbing himself, essentially. And so we went round and round and round, and then the second day, a second juror, another black lady, threatened to leave, wrote a note to the judge and said, "This is too personal, too racial. We feel that the white people are just attacking us, and they're too impatient. They want to leave. They don't care about the fate of this young man." And she wrote a note, and ultimately I was sent out by the other black ladies to convince her to come back in. I spent like 45 minutes convincing her to come back into the room, and she finally came back in, and we ultimately decided to essentially find him not guilty of assault with a dangerous weapon, but we found him guilty of simple assault.
Mm-hmm.
Which later on, so we then, announced the verdict and everything happens, and then afterwards, the lawyers, the prosecutor and the defending lawyer, both came back and asked to speak to the jury, and they wanted to interview us about why we went this way, and it was kind of amazing because the Carlos Galloway's lawyer the other thing that the jury agreed upon universally was that Carlos Galloway's lawyer was a terrible lawyer. He did not do a very good job defending his client. He produced no witnesses, no character witnesses. He didn't really he didn't really do anything to defend his client. And so when the defending lawyer came back, some of the black ladies were very upset, and they said, "Why didn't you do anything to defend this boy?" And he said, "I couldn't." And the inference was he was guilty. And he actually said that he'd spent months trying to convince this young man to take a plea. And that the plea that the government had been offering, though, was a felony assault charge. And in fact, what the jury ended up convicting him of, simple assault, was only a misdemeanor. Ultimately, he was right not to take a plea because the jury was softer on him than the government had.
Ken?
Sorry, go ahead.
I know there just was a little bit of noise there coming from Ken's camera, and I don't know what it was, so I apologize for that.
But so he was fine. He did actually make the better call for himself, and of course, the inference, since his lawyer says I couldn't defend him, was that he had told the lawyer that in fact he had used the knife.
Yes, the inference is that he had told the lawyer that he actually had used the knife, and the lawyer basically had encouraged him to take a deal with the government to plead guilty, but that he refused to do that because he wanted to go to trial. And so they went through the whole process of a grand jury to indict him, and then the trial itself, which cost the taxpayer, by the way, thousands and thousands of dollars.
Yeah.
But ultimately, we gave him we found him guilty of a lighter charge than he would have been found if he had been, if he'd actually taken the deal with the government. But, and this is an interesting question here, and it's one that I debated with my fellow jurors, both white and black, after the case. If that had happened in Georgetown, and it had been which is a Tony part of Washington, and it had been some white boy, would the police even have arrested him? Wouldn't they just have maybe gone to his parents and said, this kid got into trouble, you should watch your child more, give him a slap on the wrist, discipline him, put him on probation, do whatever. And we don't know at all Carlos Galloway's history. Maybe he has a history of assaults. We don't know. Nobody told us. Maybe he doesn't, but he looked very, very young. We never found out his age. And to be fair, I think almost everybody in the jury thought, why are we here for this? This seems like a very minor infraction. And it seemed like a lot of kind of the government throwing the book at a guy who wasn't, the ultimate sort of wound wasn't that grave,
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, you could argue ultimately justice was done to some degree because we felt that it was silly to ultimately convict this young man and potentially ruin his life for something that, if he'd been in another part of town and potentially another race, he would never have gone to trial for.
What did the prosecuting attorney want to tell the jury?
The prosecuting attorney just wanted to figure out why on earth we didn't find him guilty. She thought it was a slam dunk case, and she just, as she was listening to what we were saying about why we didn't find him guilty, she was just like, knocking her sort of papers over her head, kind of like, oh my God, like how can you guys not believe this stuff? But I think that there was, and to some degree, look, there's a long history in America of jury nullification, and I don't know if you could argue that what we ultimately decided was jury nullification. It certainly was not what the judge ordered us to do. If we had followed the strict instructions of the judge, we probably would have found him guilty of assault with a dangerous weapon. But we ultimately decided that we threw out a lot of the credibility of witnesses who were pretty credible, because we just didn't believe, many of us, the jury, didn't believe in the credibility of the system, because they felt that the system was stacked against them, and therefore everything in the system should be questioned and everything in the system should be challenged. And so they actively challenged the system. And that is, I mean, look, jury nullification goes back to the Jim Crow era in the opposite direction, where all white juries consistently found white people innocent of any kind of crimes against black people, because they didn't feel like it was appropriate for white people to go to jail for hurting or harming or doing whatever to black people. In this
And
case,
by extension, finding black people guilty of crimes that they hadn't committed against white people.
absolutely. And then and I interviewed, there's a expert at Georgetown and an expert at the American Civil Liberties Union, their Civil Rights Project, who said that increasingly in the last sort of 20, 30 years, you've seen the opposite trend of jury nullification on the opposite side, where black jurors don't want to convict people like this young Carlos Galloway because they don't trust the system. And I think that certainly is what happened in our jury, and I wouldn't be surprised if it happened more and more in the system, because look, I mean, the week that we found him guilty of simple assault, Carlos Galloway, was the same week that the Justice Department came out with that scathing report of, against the Baltimore City Police Department for the killing of Freddie Gray and for rampant targeting against African Americans in those neighborhoods. And so I think that you can see, I mean, like, it was very striking to me that there's a real correlation between what the black ladies of the jury was saying and what was happening in the news.
One of the things that I wondered after I read that is, of course, this was a 6 blacks, 5 whites, and 1 Eurasian, yourself, jury, but no Hispanics. And I couldn't help but wonder how, now that we really, especially in places like where I live, which is Arizona, we have a 3, or if you consider the Native Americans who live, here in town, 4 race kind of mix, whether or not how that's going to play out. And one of my concerns is that the system that exists is going to try and play people of color off against one another in order to keep that the white influence intact. And I was wondering if you had any, I mean, obviously this goes beyond your experience, but I was wondering, Jay, if you had any thoughts about what's going to happen as we add Hispanics so strongly into our mix as a country.
I don't know. That's an interesting question. And, it's true that we didn't have any Hispanics in our jury. I mean, I think it's very hard to say that, you're going to play one race off of each other against another in a jury setting, because in a jury setting, you have to come, at least in Washington, D.C., and it's not this case everywhere, but in Washington, you have to come to a unanimous decision. Mm-hmm. And even if there's one person who holds out, that's a hung jury for us in Washington. We very nearly hung on this case. Mm-hmm. But I think that you would just end up seeing more and more hung juries. And I would be curious to see the statistics in America of how many cases are hung, particularly cases that involving race. My guess, and I'm totally unscientific, I have no idea, but my guess is, based off of my personal experience, is that there probably are more hung juries these days than there have been in the past, because you see more and more minorities willing to stand up to the system and say, no, I'm not going to be complacent in this system.
as you think back on your experience, this is a very powerful personal experience. Years ago, I'm sure you've seen it, I watched many times, fascinated by the movie 12 Angry Men. And I thought, wow, what a powerful statement about the jury process. This is a much more subtle one. This one, in that one, ultimately, the defendant was proven innocent. In this, not so much. But how do you feel yourself looking back on it in terms of, do you feel justice was better served by this verdict than if either group had been able to make the decision by itself?
That's a great question. And I guess I would say yes, because if it had been up to the black ladies, the proponents of the black ladies, they would have acquitted, most likely. And there was a push towards the end by them to acquit him. Mm-hmm. And if it had been up to most of the white people, they probably would have found him guilty of assault with a dangerous weapon. Now, here's the thing. I mean, I don't know. Maybe Carlos Galloway, and we don't know enough about this case to know fully. Maybe Carlos Galloway is a young man who just had one bad incident, and this sort of gives him a chance to turn his life around. It means that he won't go to prison necessarily for, significant years of his life, and maybe he can make something of his life that's productive and great and become a really constructive part of society. On the other hand, maybe Carlos Galloway has a history of assault, and this is yet another assault that he's got, and he becomes increasingly violent and falls in with, criminals and other people, and he spirals down and ends up, and the next time he stabs somebody, he kills them. I can't say which way it would ever go, and I think nor can anybody in the jury. We weren't given that information. We didn't have enough information to know that about him. And so I guess I would say that having a mix of races in the jury certainly produced a much more moderated outcome than what it would have been if the jury had been one group versus another. But I don't know. I don't think any of us know whether or not in the long run that decision was a good one or a bad one.
Yeah. In terms of the abstract, it seems more moderate and possibly more just. In terms of the reality, well, that's something only time could tell if somebody were able to see what this young man does with his life. One thing I'm very aware of, having as a person who worked as a psychologist and did reports for juvenile courts many times, is that I don't know how old this young man was, but what I do know is that if he had been under the age of 16, his fate would have been left not to a jury, but to a system that would not have that kind of moderation to it.
Yeah, that's true. And we did ask, how old he was, and we were instructed to only pay attention to the evidence that was presented to us. So we were like, and that was really striking to me too, is that we had all these questions about the case that we weren't allowed to ask any of those questions because we were instructed to only weigh the evidence that was presented to us and we weren't allowed to do anything. And as a journalist, obviously I wanted to investigate. I wanted to know more. I wanted to hear more about this young man's history, who he was, like what was going on. And I know, but we weren't allowed that information. So we had to make the best possible decision we could based off of the information we were given, which seemed so imperfect to me. But that's the system.
Well, I think that the sentencing phase, of course, these are things that the judge is supposed to take into account, and he gets all this input to decide whether an action actually broke the law or not. You have to ask, well, should the jury know this? And it really is, it's one of those things. I've never had an acceptable in my own mind the answer to that question. The only thing I know is that if I had gone to law school, I'm sure we would have argued about it in that criminal justice classroom.
Yeah.
Now, folks, if you think this kind of story is important, and I sure do, and I know that, Monica, that you do, look for J. Newton Small. That's a hyphenated last name, by the way, Newton Small, in Time Magazine. But also, Jay, you've written a book. I love the title of your book. I love the pun in the book, name of the book. It's called Broad Influence, How Women Are Changing the Way America Works. And I haven't read it yet, but I'm planning to. Tell me what just very quickly, if you could, like an elevator pitch. What is the book about?
Sure. So 3 years ago, during the government shutdown, I wrote a story in Time about the women of the Senate coming together to restart the negotiations to reopen the government when none of the men would talk to each other. And I had a lot of interest in writing a book out of that, but all of the women of the Senate were writing their own books and didn't need one from me. But what interested me most was that it was the first time the Senate was 20% women. And it turns out there's a huge body of research out there that shows that whether it's a legislature like the Senate or a corporate board, a Navy ship, or an appellate court, when women reach between 20 and 30% of an institution, they really begin to change the way things are done and have a really big impact. And so my book collects all the areas where we're reaching that tipping point and the differences that they're making. And then it looks at the places where we haven't quite reached it yet, and then makes the case about why we need to get there across the board.
You know, if you haven't picked up my accent yet, Jay, I'm a New Englander. I grew up partly in Maine and partly in Massachusetts. And I remember when Margaret Chase Smith was elected to the Senate from Maine, and how wonderful I thought it was that we were going to have a strong female voice in the halls of power. Now, of course, we may very well in November elect our first female president. We have two women running, of course, Hillary Clinton and Jill Stein. And it's a very exciting time for our country that we are beginning to think about the fact that power should be shared across not only races, as we've been talking about in the jury room, but across gender. And one of the things that I'm wondering about is that as we do make that change, as we do but encourage and change so that our culture accepts more women in positions of influence and making decisions, do you think that men are going to resist? Are we going to see the men fighting back to stop such usurpation of our male prerogatives?
I mean, I think you could argue that a large part of Donald Trump's supporters are white men who feel that their voices have ceased to be heard in America, that they have become a minority in America, and that is something that really angers them and really disturbs them. And they're just because we have. And I actually interviewed Hillary for the book, although not Jill Stein, because she wasn't a candidate by the time when I was writing the book. But if you look at, I mean, even the sort of the campaign trail these days and the sexism that still exists in the campaign trail, I think there is still a lot of pushback against the idea. I mean, even if it's not overt, there's still a lot of pushback against the idea of a female president. And so, for example, Bernie, and I think this is, some of it's just innate bias. People don't even realize that they have it. But, for example, Bernie Sanders can yell at you for 40 minutes and you're like, yeah, yell at me for 40 more, right? He totally can be inspirational just by his pure anger and just exasperation of the system. But Hillary, when she raises her voice and tries to show passion, and this happens with all women, the same thing happened with Elizabeth Warren when she ran in Massachusetts, or pretty much any woman that's run for office. When women raise their voices, people say, "Oh my God, she's so shrill. She's screaming. Why is she yelling at me?" And people tend to hear mom disciplining them, and that's an unconscious bias. But it's one that makes it very difficult for a woman running for office to show passion and to demonstrate, a true belief for what they're doing for their country. So even things like that, I think, are still challenges for female candidates across the board.
Yeah, I just extend on that a little bit beyond that and say, at the same time, if Hillary comes on very wonkish and very issue oriented, people say she lacks feeling and emotion. So women really get it on both sides.
Yeah, that's true. It's very true. She's a pragmatist. She's uninspiring. You see that a lot with a lot of female leaders. I think that there's hardly a female leader out there that I can think of that can soar. I mean, Michelle Obama's speech at the convention is probably the one exception. But if you think of Angela Merkel or Theresa May in the UK, most even Margaret Thatcher, most female leaders that we've had in our society in the world have been very pragmatic women. There are not. It's women find it very difficult to kind of soar and inspire the way sort of Barack Obama can give these amazing speeches about the arc of the moral universe, bending towards justice. That's very hard for a woman to do.
Yeah, we have not had great female orators to date, but I have a feeling we're going to.
Well, I hope so, because that would mean that we've made progress and we're beginning to level the field.
Yeah. Of course, again, being a New Englander, and I look at, for example, the two senators that you must have interviewed from the state of Maine.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Olympia Snowe and Susan Collins, yes. I interviewed them both.
Yeah, two incredibly wonderful senators, I think.
And also, if you look at New Hampshire, amazing tradition for women in New Hampshire, women in elected office.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. But of course, then they're New Englanders, and we all know we New Englanders are the best, right? I had to say that, didn't I, Monica?
That's okay.
Before we finish this interview, I did want to mention one more topic because, folks, Jay Newton Small has a website. No, don't look for her name on that website. It's a very, very special startup project that she's just trying to get underway. And it's called www.memorywell.com. And that is about what, Jay?
My father passed of Alzheimer's last year, and as a journalist, when I was moving him into a home, I was his primary caregiver. They asked me to fill out this sort of 20-page questionnaire about his life, and I was like, "You're never going to remember 20 pages of data points for the 150 residents you have in this home. Why don't you let me write his story for you?" So I wrote down his story, and they loved it, and they said it really changed the way his care was given. It really helped his caregivers relate to him, and he was he got very violent, unfortunately, towards the end of his life, very agitated, which is common. About 20% of Alzheimer's sufferers experience that, and it really helped his caregivers ease him. Knowing his story, it gave them a lot of tools to kind of redirect him when he was getting aggressive. And so a group of us started a company, I guess you could say, a startup, just a project really, writing the life stories of Alzheimer's sufferers for these homes. And we're working with a few homes, some St. Paul's House in Chicago and Sage Senior Living in Maryland and Pennsylvania. And then we're piloting with 4 others and we've developed this website, which is a mobile responsive website. We hope to make it into an app one day. I call it Facebook for people who can't remember who they are. But the stories kind of anchor the sites for each of the people, and you can sort of see the sample stories if you go to the website. And then loved ones, sort of family members, upload their loved ones' favorite music and art and photographs. And that way, when caregivers sit with them, or even when family members sit with them, they have all this information at their fingertips to engage them with, their favorite movies or their favorite music, readings, things like that. And so it really helps. With Alzheimer's, it's all about engagement, and you really want to help people engage as much as possible. So,
it's very, very interesting you say that, because as I had shared with you before we started the interview, my mother had Alzheimer's, more late onset, but she's definitely there. And I would visit her, and I was very struck again, I said, I grew up in Maine and Massachusetts. We spent our summers, we spent about 3.5 months a year up in Maine, the rest of the time down in Massachusetts. And my mother would talk a lot in those last years about going home and missing home. Mm-hmm. And everybody thought that she was talking about Massachusetts, except for me. And because of my greatest, deepest connection being to Maine, I assumed she was talking about Maine. And since we had only lived in apartments in Massachusetts, she'd never owned a home in Massachusetts, but we did own the places in Maine. That was actually what she was talking about. And so everybody else is talking to her, trying to relate to her about the bagel store on the corner. And I'm trying to relate to her and doing much more successfully of the sunset on the lake. So I think your idea of making those memories and helping people to identify what memories really are meaningful to somebody who is suffering from a dementia is really just a wonderful, wonderful contribution.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. I'm really passionate about the idea because it made such a difference in my father's care, and these homes are such isolating places, and I really want to help build community where none exists. So
absolutely. Well, folks, we've been talking with Jay Newton Small, who writes for Time Magazine and has covered some stories, just incredibly powerful topics. You've heard her mention a few. Of course, today we've been talking particularly about her experience on a jury in Washington, D.C., where she served as a juror, and the issue of race there. But she's also covered things like the horror of the church shooting in, was it Charleston?
Yes, in Charleston. The Emmanuel shooting in Charleston last year.
And then the horror, again, of the shooting of the Dallas police. And Jay, I just cannot imagine how emotionally overwhelming covering some of these stories must be. And as somebody who grew up believing that freedom of the press was the number one freedom. Forget religion, forget the press. Without the press, we have no information on which to build our lives and our judgments. And when I run into a reporter such as yourself, who is providing such quality writing, I just want to thank you from the bottom.
Very much. Yeah, we need more like you, Jay.
Well, that's really kind of you, Ken and Monica. I appreciate that. But I think, I worry about the press a lot. There's things are changing so much in our medium, as you know.
Yes, absolutely.
And folks, I'm going to suggest, even before I've read it, that you read Jay's book, Broad Influence: How Women Are Changing the Way America Works. Please go look for it. I know I'm going to read it. It's just made it to I have 2 books I have in hand right now to read for the show, and then I'm going to read that one. And I hope after that, Jay, that you will return to talk about it, and perhaps also to share some more about memorywell.com, which sounds to me like just an amazing contribution to the area of care of those with dementia.
Well, thank you so much. I'd be happy to come back anytime, Ken and Monica. It's been a pleasure chatting with you.
We'd love to have you back. And thank you so much for taking time out of your extremely busy schedule to talk with us today.
No, I appreciate it. Thanks for your interest. And I look forward to chatting again soon.
Great. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Monica, there was one thing that Jay and I didn't get into, but that I really want to comment on about women in the workplace. Not only do they change the levels of civility and effectiveness and thoughtfulness and so many things that go on to make things happen better in the workplace. And we'll be talking about that, as I said, in a future program after I've read her book. But there's
Yeah.
something else about women at work. They work harder.
You
And
know, I
here on It Matters Radio, they do. So, folks, I have to say this, because Monica doesn't listen to me when I express this concern, but I know that I am very concerned about how hard Punky has been working.
yes.
Punky is a very busy cat.
Yeah, you saw her in the show. Gosh.
Yeah. Now, folks, Punky isn't just going back and forth on Monica's lap for no reason. She's actually checking to make sure the show is done right.
Yes.
She's whispering into Monica's ears the various directorial cues.
That I better listen to. Yes.
You better listen to. She writes a monthly newsletter from her little box,
Hmm.
and she lets us know what she does and doesn't approve of. And she's a hardworking feline. And folks, a lot of you go to Facebook, you're liking It Matters Radio, and we appreciate that.
Oh, yes, we
You're
do.
going to Punky's page and liking that. And Punky has this wonderful view of the world as seen through an animal's eyes. And she really wants to be noticed more.
Yes.
Don't we all? So please, because we have this very hardworking cat who, I hate to say it, and I hope she's not listening, but we really do have to
Sleeping.
make sure she doesn't get too much tuna fish.
Yeah.
So because of that, we have to pay her off an attention. So please, folks, like her page.
Yeah, she would really love that because she's always sharing things about animals on there, and I think people would enjoy it very much.
I think so. Now the other member of the team I want to mention who also works very hard is Monica Brinkman. Now, folks, you know Monica from the show. You may also listen to our other Sunday show where Monica hosts the music guest. You may know her from our Indie Euro shows. And, oh, God, how many shows are you doing now, Monica?
Well, we're actually, this is really exciting for me, and even though it's more work, but we have actually three separate indie shows. So you'll notice that what we have in the title now for our shows Monday through Saturday at 7 p.m. is called It Matters Radio Indie Music Show. Because Monday through Wednesday we have our Euro Indie show where you vote, and it's music from all over the world. It's
Right.
in English. There's also songs that are in different languages, and you get to vote on your favorite. And then on Friday, we present the top 20 songs that you voted in. So
Right.
I hope you can support not just musicians here in America, and I'm hoping people from other parts of the world are watching us also, but people from all over the world because
Right.
they all need our support. And, what would we do without musicians? Now, what's really exciting every Thursday, because you're probably wondering what happened to Thursday. Uh, we have a new partner, and they're called Eon Indie Magazine. Okay, what's a magazine got to do with music? Well, they feature artists every month, and what they do is they send us music from their featured artists, and they are outstanding artists. I think you're just going to fall in love with them. So I do host that and I narrate it and tell you a little bit about each of the guests in between the songs. And we played it every Thursday. Now it will be the same show every Thursday because not everybody can watch the show, on the same Thursday. So you'll have an opportunity to see it again if you loved it and want to hear them again, or tune in for the first time, and that'll be monthly on Thursday at 7 p.m. And then on Saturday night, this is just wonderful. Also, World Music Stage Radio has also partnered with us where we are presenting their top 10 music picks of the week. And that's some more outstanding music. I mean, you're just going to love it. I can't express how much you're going to embrace those two shows. And I hope you'll check out the Euro Indie shows also. But
So,
it's,
folks, the point of all of this is we have a very busy cat and a very busy cat owner.
yeah,
The cat owner really, really, if
she
you're
got
getting
fur on me, Ken.
confused, yeah, if you're getting confused by all of this stuff, one way to keep clear on it is to visit us at our website, which is www.itmattersradio.com. And another thing is to subscribe using that website, subscribe to Punky's newsletter,
Hmm.
because Punky will keep you up to date on what's happening.
Yes, she will.
And don't you believe it when she tells you to send anchovies.
Yeah.
Yeah. She's not. It's like when you were a kid at summer camp. You're not allowed. She's not allowed to get packages. Okay?
That's right.
That's right.
That's right. But
Now, folks, I'm going to ask you something else, and Monica doesn't know I'm going to do this, but I'm going to tell you.
all
If
right.
you look on Amazon.com, you're going to find Monica Brinkman
Yeah.
because she writes books. She writes very good books. She writes speculative fiction, and it's very, very fine stuff.
Oh, thank you.
And why don't you go and check out her stuff? She has some short ebooks that for very little money you can sample her writing, and she also has a couple full-length books that are well worth your reading. And okay, just go to Amazon.com and look for Monica Brinkman. And now she's going to tell you you should also look for my books, and you should.
That's
But
right.
let's emphasize Monica tonight.
How did you know I was going to say that?
Know you, Monica. Now, folks, just one last little thing. You know, after the show airs tonight, Monica, even more work for her, puts it up on iTunes, on
YouTube.
YouTube. I'm sorry, I had a brain freeze there for a moment. On YouTube as a podcast. So, you know, share it, please, especially if you've enjoyed listening to Jay Newton Small, who I thought was just fascinating.
Yes, she was.
You know, just share that with people. Share that link. Go on your Facebook page and say, hey, folks, have you heard of It Matters Radio? Check this link out. And by the way, you know what's really wonderful? If you put a little @ sign before It Matters Radio, it'll turn into a link, and then people can go right to the It Matters Radio
Yeah.
page on Facebook, which is kind of cool. But please help get word out, because we only can help our authors and our musicians and all of our wonderful friends if we have listeners. And you are kind enough to be our listener this evening.
Yes.
Please help us get more listeners, because we have just so many wonderful guests lined up, musical guests and spoken word guests, and of course, all of this great music Monica was mentioning.
Well, you know what I thought was funny, and I had to mention this. If anyone saw our show at 3 p.m. today, Ken, they would think that you and I had planned having that musical guest on and your guest on, because if you watched it, his name is Ida Lee, and he is working to reform the prisons. And I had no idea, believe me, that Ken was going to have someone speak about our jury system, which ultimately
We're
leads
going
to
to be
prison.
revisiting prisons. I know we're going to be revisiting prisons, because
Yeah.
that's an important topic. Criminal justice is an important topic, especially if we're going to be able to move forward as a country that everybody feels safe in. Because
Exactly.
you don't want to feel you're a danger because criminals are running rampant, but you also don't want to feel like you're going to be mistreated, locked up, and abused because of your economic status, the color of your skin, or your accent, or something like that. Justice,
Or to be political, as I always say, because the prison system wants to make more money.
yeah. Well, that's certainly a topic we can bring up to
Yeah,
private prisons.
yeah.
So, folks, thank you again for listening. Thank you so much for sharing our show with others, and
Yes.
have a wonderful rest of your Sunday.
Yes, please do go and come back again soon. Love to you all. Take care. Bye bye, Ken.
Bye.